Quintus Fufius Calenus, Consul 47 BCE. A new man in Roman politics, Quintus Fufius Calenus was a distinguished orator and barrister, much like his later rival Cicero. However, his skill set was wider than Cicero's, and he would show talent in the military sphere. Calenus also had a rivalry with the great Hortensius, and that rivalry mostly revolved around Calenus' support for the notorious Clodius. In 59, Calenus threw in his lot with Caesar in the First Triumvirate, although his work as praetor was not particularly prominent in the overall scheme of the consulship of Julius and Caesar. For reasons that are unclear, but possibly because he does not seem to have been on good terms with Pompey and Crassus, Calenus' career now stalled. His new son-in-law, Vibius Pansa, was reasonably talented, but his prospects were also modest, at least until Caesar prevailed over Pompey. Calenus' consulship in 47 was his reward for services rendered to Caesar, and he may have thought that this 3-month run in Rome's highest office would prove to be his pinnacle. However, the assassination of Caesar opened up new possibilities and shook up old loyalties and alliances. By the time that 43 BCE rolled around, Mark Antony was attempting to unify the Caesarians for open battle with the assassins, and Cicero wanted to use the Senate to legitimize the assassins and outlaw Antony, steadily dividing and conquering the remaining Caesarian leaders until there were none left. It is well known also that Octavian was seeking a third path, but these were not the only options available. As Anna Mieszewska argued, Calenus' main goal was to preserve the peace during the heated debates in January and February of 43. This is in spite of the usual framing, as we inherited from Cicero, of Calenus as a mere puppet of Mark Antony. Despite being forced to combat Cicero with word and wit, hardly an easy task for anyone, Calenus held his own in those months. Cicero eventually did get his war, but perhaps due to the abuse he heaped upon Calenus combined with the death of Pansa, Calenus decided to throw in his lot with Antony, which put him in an excellent position going into the Second Triumvirate. Calenus' refusal to engage in the Perusine War in 40, combined with his unfortunate death at the time, proved to be a massive boon to Octavian, who took over the late Calenus' legions and was then poised from 40 onward to share the Roman world with Antony as an equal. Quintus Fufius Calenus hailed from a minor plebeian gens. His family had been in politics for a couple of generations prior to his birth, and, naturally enough, he dreamed of being the first in his family to attain the consulship. That being said, his odds were not necessarily that great, given that in the previous couple of generations none of his predecessors had made it very far. The man who was most likely his grandfather, and certainly a man who bore the same name, Quintus Fufius Calenus, was recorded as expressing the opinion that the greatest man of his generation was Scipio Nasica Serapio, because he had been the one who led a mob to murder Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus back in the late 130s. And so this instance of mob violence is often considered to be the beginning of the late Republic today, but for the kind of faction that would become known as the Optimates, this was also kind of the beginning of a tradition of suppressing populist politics. We also know that Roman politics was multifaceted and that not all loyalties were ironclad, that not everyone inherited a political stance from their family. We know, for instance, that in Caesar's camp during the Civil War, you have someone named Cato, you have a Sulla, you have a Brutus, and you have a Cassius Longinus. So you have people who are mostly cousins of the more famous member of the family, but still it shows that just because your name was associated with a certain political brand does not always mean that you yourself were bound to be that. And it's also worth mentioning, of course, one of Caesar's cousins, one of his younger cousins, was actually with Pompey in the Civil War. As far as Calenus' early preparation, he would be a skilled orator. He also would become very learned in the law, and this would enable him later to famously take on both Hortensius and Cicero and hold his own. And what's interesting, too, is that despite the relatively late date of his consulship, it's pretty clear that he must have been about the same age as these other two men. He was probably just a little bit younger than Cicero, and maybe as much as a decade younger than Hortensius, but he was certainly closer to their age than he was to the age of a lot of the other men who were rising to the consulship in the 40s. So most likely by the time he rises to his highest office, he'll be about 60 years old. And this is all based on some work earlier by the German scholar Munzer, who thinks that he began his career in the 80s, and so that would make him about the same age as Caesar and Cicero. The first time we encounter Calenus in our sources is in the year 61. This year he was serving as one of the tribunes of the plebs, and here we would see the Bonad DEA Scandal break out. And what this was is that there was a festival for the good goddess, the Bonad DEA, and it was led by and exclusively for women. And as the wife of the Pontifex Maximus, it fell to Julius Caesar's wife to conduct the ceremony at their home. So she was hosting a major gathering of many of the noble women in Rome, and for whatever reason, Clodius, who at this time was still a patrician, he had not yet become a plebeian and started his career as a gang leader, but he still was up to no good, and he decided that he was going to dress up as a woman and attend. Well, this was considered sacrilege. He got caught, he got chased out of the house, and after months and months of heated debate and many, many jokes, he was now taken to court, and many of his rivals were convinced that he needed to die for his transgressions. And perhaps the biggest hard-ass on this issue was Quintus Hortensius Hortulus, who had been consul back in 69. Hortensius was still the king of the law courts. Maybe he was starting to lose that reputation because of his defeats at the hands of Cicero, but he was still at least the second best orator in Rome. And he certainly wanted to get rid of Clodius, who he saw as a cancer in the state. Hortensius was very much an optimate, and he wanted to eliminate the populist faction in Rome altogether. And so he wanted to set up a special tribunal, and then he wanted to more or less hand select people who were guaranteed to convict Clodius. However, there were legal issues with that. Obviously, a Roman citizen should receive a trial that is fair by the standards of Roman law, and so Calenus objected to this proposal, and he used his knowledge of the law to outmaneuver Hortensius and create not one vote on both things together as Hortensius wanted, because he knew that there would be problems about the specially selected judges. So Calenus makes these two votes separate. So yes, there will be a special tribunal, but it will be filled by judges normally. So this was a big service to Clodius, and we don't really know exactly why Calenus did it. Now, obviously, his detractors would say he did it because he was in Clodius's pocket, but it's also just as likely that he wanted to avoid any legal abnormalities. He wanted to avoid situations that would put people in legal difficulties. He wanted to defend the rights that Romans were accustomed to having if they were high-ranking citizens. So we're not really sure exactly what Calenus's motives were, but I actually kind of lean more toward the latter explanation, that he was in fact trying to defend Roman legal norms. We now need to try to consider where Calenus fit into the politics of his day. He was still serving as tribune after Clodius was acquitted, and by all accounts the acquittal was only secured because of a very generous distribution of bribe money. But Calenus, still serving as tribune, decided to summon Pompey to a contio, a public meeting, and then ask him to share his views. At this time, Pompey was far and away the most important man in Roman politics. He'd just returned from the East, and everyone wanted to hear the great man speak and wanted to know where he stood on all these issues. And so when Pompey was asked about the acquittal of Clodius, he really tried and kind of failed to skirt the issue. He spoke in generalities. He talked about the Senate's authority and respecting it. He talked about just vague things like how great Rome is, just nothing that actually answered the question. And so this turned out to be an embarrassing performance, and you really can't blame Calenus too much for this, because this is exactly the kind of question that Pompey, as the leading figure in Roman politics, should have been able to handle, and yet he couldn't. And so this made him look foolish, in addition to another time this happened before the Senate, where a senator asked him to address the Senate and tell them what he thought about Clodius, and he still did the same song and dance. So, There's a pretty good chance that Pompey, being vain and also having been humiliated after years of being Rome's greatest hero, held a bit of a grudge over this. The First Triumvirate would form right before the election of Caesar in 59, and at this time Calenus would sign up, so he would be one of the followers of the First Triumvirate, but it seems like he was mostly aligned with Caesar and Clodius. And later on, Clodius would get the blessing of the First Triumvirate to become a plebeian and then start leading gangs when he served as tribune. So Calenus seems to have had pretty good relations with Caesar and Clodius, but it's possible that he had a lot of bad blood with Pompey. And actually, that was not necessarily all that rare. There were a number of people who really were not big fans of Pompey, and sometimes that gets papered over because of the fact that so many of those kind of right-wing optimates would later go and serve with Pompey during the Civil War. But actually, when the First Triumvirate started, many of them saw Pompey as kind of the final boss of evil Roman politicians. So, we're not really sure exactly how to categorize Calenus's politics. He is someone who seems to have been rather moderate in terms of his personal disposition. He tended to like legal categories and procedures. At the same time, though, he was willing to defend people like Clodius. And so, his politics are a little bit confusing if we think about them by most of the categories we're familiar with. I guess the best basic kind of rule of thumb or kind of just standby to refer to his politics would probably just be to call him a moderate Caesarian and leave it at that. So that's what we'll do for now. Well, now let's talk about his actual performance in office in 59 as praetor. In 59, Gaius Julius Caesar became consul alongside of Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, but of course all the wits called the year the consulship of Julius and Caesar because once Bibulus turned obstructionist, Caesar famously shut him down, and Bibulus was left at home just issuing proclamations about bad omens, while Caesar passed an agenda which was mostly finding land for Pompey's veterans and confirming the various settlements that Pompey made in the east. This year would go down as very controversial, and obviously Caesar and some of his leading supporters were forever stained, at least in the eyes of their political opponents, who said that they engaged in all manner of irregularities. Eventually, most of the odium for what had happened in 59 fell upon Caesar personally, but at the time, many of the more outspoken critics of Caesar blamed everyone who was a part of this. In terms of Calenus's own dealings this year, he was probably the most senior supporter of Caesar in the government at this time as a sitting praetor, but for the most part he seems to have largely kept himself clean while supporting Caesar. He doesn't seem to have taken as much damage to his reputation as, say, Publius Vatinius did. Calenus during this time laid out at least one bill that passed, and this was more or less kind of reconfirming that every jury would have 3 panels for senators, equestrians, and another category. This seems to have been existing law, but it was repassed, perhaps because it wasn't being observed properly, and that very much fits in with Calenus's own agenda. And in fact, as we'll see when we look at Vatinius, it was fairly common for Caesar's so-called henchmen to have their own agendas and their own priorities and to pursue those while also backing Caesar's priorities. And in fact, of all of the various people serving under Caesar in 59, by far the most prominent was the tribune, Publius Vatinius, who would later become Calenus's consular colleague in 47. Even before that, they would serve together in the Greece campaign of 48. One would think that having been a successful praetor in 59 and being a close ally of Caesar, that the First Triumvirate would have pushed for Calenus to get a consulship in the 50s, but that was not the case. In fact, Calenus's career seemed to be at a standstill. That being said, he did remain active in the Senate. He also was active in the law courts, although of course we don't know his comings and goings nearly as well as we do for, say, Cicero or even for Hortensius. We do know that in 56 he acted as a witness at the trial of Marcus Caelius Rufus. This trial was largely spearheaded, at least behind the scenes, by Clodius, an ally of Calenus, and the accusation was that Caelius had murdered an Egyptian envoy. Cicero would defend his old friend Caelius and effectively say that this was a lover's quarrel where Clodius's sister Clodia was actually going after Caelius because of their breakup. So this is one of the more famous cases in Roman legal history, and Calenus would play a pretty minor role as a witness, presumably in favor of the prosecution. Several years later, Clodius was murdered by Milo right outside of the city. By this point, the Optimates had their own gang led by Milo. And at this point, Calenus would find himself once again fighting over issues of law and order with Hortensius in terms of procedure. And this time, their roles were reversed. So Calenus was the one pushing for a tribunal with special rigged rules to try to get Milo convicted, whereas Hortensius wanted to defend Milo, and so it was a strange reversal in their roles from last time, and also shows how many times these men were not really acting that much upon legal principle as they were upon partisan differences. But there is still a case to be made that Calenus the first time was acting on principle, and the second time was acting out of partisan motives. And the reason for that is that at the time of the Bonad DEA Scandal, there was no First Triumvirate. So he was not officially aligned with Caesar, and there's a chance that he wasn't aligned with Caesar at all until 59, and that perhaps he got in bed with Caesar because of his dealings with Clodius. We don't really know, of course. I'm just pointing out that he didn't necessarily pursue a defined, consistent policy from 61 until nearly 10 years later in 52. Then in 51, Calenus would go to Gaul. He would serve as one of Caesar's legates, and this seems to have been his first tour of duty there. Many of Caesar's other major lieutenants had already been there. Calenus most famously would hold down the territory of the Carnutes, while Caesar would go and fight one of his last major battles at Uxellodunum. And so Calenus there would just hold a couple legions and garrison an area for the winter. Fairly humdrum stuff, but still providing valuable service to Caesar and showing that he was a bit of a man for all seasons. Calenus doesn't reappear for 2 years, and this time he is now participating in Caesar's first invasion of Spain in 49. This is the so-called Ilerda campaign because the decisive battle against Petrius and Afranius was fought at Ilerda. This was the campaign where Caesar famously fought the army without a general first and defeated them quickly and decisively. And after defeating them quickly and setting up governors and all of that, Caesar decided that some of the legions from Spain couldn't be trusted, and so he marched them all the way deep into Gaul and then left formal demobilization in the hands of Calenus. The way that Calenus handled this is to have loyal legions in the front and rear of the legions he was escorting, and then once they were past the Varus River, where they were not all that far from Italy even, they were then formally informed that their services were no longer needed and that they were going to be demobilized. And so these men presumably, although we don't know this for certain, made their way back to Spain, and they probably formed a lot of the core of the army that young Gnaeus Pompeius would raise in 45 and fight at the Battle of Mundo with. So this was something that had some lasting consequences, and it also does show that Calenus could be entrusted with some relatively significant, even if unglamorous tasks, such as demobilizing potentially hostile and disgruntled men. Speaking of unglamorous and thankless work, Caesar had another task in mind for his former praetor, and that task was nothing less than convoying over the other half of Caesar's army. Caesar had only been able to move about half his army across the Adriatic in his initial invasion of Greece because of a lack of ships, and so he sent Calenus back with his transports to pick up the rest of the men. Well, possibly due to error on Calenus's part, or possibly due to bad luck, or Bibulus being alert, we're not really sure exactly why this happened, but Calenus set sail a little bit late, and that meant that he was not quite in time to catch the favorable night wind that blows west. And so because of that, his ships were a little slow moving, and Bibulus was able to actually intercept the fleet and sink 30 of the transports before they could get back to Italy and load up some of Caesar's men. Calenus did get the rest of the ships back, however, and he loaded as many men as he could, but then Caesar sent a letter and told him that the Pompeian fleet was on high alert, so Calenus decided that discretion was the better half of valor, and he decided not to risk it. One ship, being bolder than the rest, did risk it, and they were captured. So it proves that Calenus's caution in this case was correct, and the men who were captured were now actually all massacred. So the rowers and crewmen and soldiers were all killed. And this is because Bibulus, who was an old and bitter rival of Caesar, had a take-no-prisoners mentality, and in general, the Pompeians were quite ruthless and really started to up the ante of retribution and reprisals before Caesar did. Anyhow, Calenus perhaps saved some lives by deciding not to go back when he did. That being said, he still needed to go, and Caesar perhaps was now thinking that Calenus was getting a little overcautious, so he was going to have to send someone to break through and make sure that Calenus did his job. In spite of the fact that Caesar himself wrote the section of the commentaries concerned with Calenus and Antony crossing over to Greece, it is rather vaguely worded. In fact, he talks about writing to Antony and Calenus in rather stern terms, implying that now they're co-commanders. So it's not really clear what the division of authority was. Perhaps Calenus was fleet commander and Antony was the commander of the remaining ground troops. We're not really sure. But at any rate, Caesar had now convinced himself that one or both of these men had feet of clay. And so he sent the legate Postumius, who went past these two senior commanders and went directly to the men and read them a letter from Caesar saying that victory was at hand if only they were to arrive in Greece. And so the men were now fired up, and they pressured their leaders Antony and Calenus to make the crossing. Later, in another source, perhaps just added as a way to build drama, but perhaps true, Antony was now contemplating betrayal. He thought that perhaps Caesar had made a mistake by inserting his army in that way into Greece, and that if he were to defect now, he'd be rewarded. But if the story is true, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, then this level of double dealing almost certainly would have applied to Calenus as well. So he and Antony most likely were partners in this if there was any fire behind the smoke. But it's also true, though, that there doesn't really appear to have been any real friendship between Antony and Calenus at this early date. So perhaps Antony would have been plotting this without reference to Calenus. It's hard to say. At any rate, they eventually do decide to set out. They will use the south wind. They'll pass Apollonia and Dyrrhachium, where Bibulus was looking for them, and then they'll land. And they will then march and rejoin Caesar, and now Caesar's army will be complete. So this was a successful operation, but it was a very difficult and treacherous one. And Caesar, while he was clearly annoyed with them early on, he quickly forgave them, and certainly was grateful that they had run the risk and figured out a way to get around the larger Pompeian fleet. Quintus Fufius Calenus ultimately did succeed at getting Caesar's men across the Adriatic, but it wasn't the most impressive or inspiring performance. Nonetheless, Caesar retained his confidence in Calenus and gave him the only significant independent command in the Greek theater. And this is a sign of special trust, because Caesar had not had the greatest experience when utilizing his various legates up to this point in the war. We have to remember that the biggest operation handled without Caesar present was Curio's invasion of Africa, where 2 legions were largely destroyed by the Numidians. And so, Caesar was a little cautious, and perhaps he turned to Calenus not only because Calenus had some ability, but also because Calenus was an older, steadier hand. Many of Caesar's other options would have been men like Antony, who were a bit aggressive and unproven. So Calenus, by being a bit older, would be seen as the safer choice. Now, when Calenus began to move along the north shore of the Gulf of Corinth to try to secure a supply line and undermine Pompey's supplies, Pompey also dispatched a legate, someone with a very minor name, to try to prevent Calenus from doing too much damage. But apparently Pompey didn't send very many men with this legate, because the legate immediately decided not to face Calenus in open battle, but rather to seal off the Isthmus of Corinth and keep the Caesarians out of the Peloponnese. And perhaps because he was undermanned, this was actually a wise move by this legate, but really all it did in the long term was to give Calenus free rein to run around central Greece and secure allies. And during this time, because he's the only one with an army there, he was able to win over Delphi, Thebes, and Orchomenus, all of which were fairly major cities. And they also are strategically located in the heart of central Greece. So this meant that now Caesar's men controlled the overland entrance to places like Attica, or the path toward the Peloponnese. So this was a fairly major pickup, especially coming as it did without cost. And now that he had reinforcements from these new allies, Calenus then began to seize other cities. So he and his allies now took several more cities for the cause, and he also was sending out envoys to win over other places. He seems to have still been doing this at the time that the Battle of Pharsalus was fought and won. So most likely Calenus was not present at Pharsalus, and he received news of it by messenger after the fact. And most likely he would have been informed to please look out for refugees coming that way, because his force was small, and if the refugees were sufficiently organized, they could turn his successes in Boeotia into a disaster. In the event, none of the Pompeian refugees arrived in central Greece, and so Calenus didn't have to deal with any major disturbances there after the Battle of Pharsalus. His task was not to continue onward, but rather to solidify Caesar's position in Greece, and this meant ultimately that as Caesar continued to move forward and to pursue Pompey, that Calenus would now be tasked with logistics, with sending forces from Greece to other places. The first operation he had to support from Greece was when Caesar decided to set sail for Alexandria from the island of Cyprus. So Caesar had learned that Pompey had gone to Egypt, and he only had one legion with him in Cyprus, so he sent for more troops, and Calenus forwarded another legion and 10 or more warships. And as we know from the course of the war in Alexandria, those reinforcements, when they arrived, would prove to be quite vital to Caesar, who would be attacked with his one legion by the entire force of the Ptolemaic army. But that's a different story for a different time. Needless to say here, though, Calenus did his part to make sure that Caesar wasn't overwhelmed and killed, as Pompey had been. Now, with so many of his troops being committed to Alexandria, they're probably already gone, including a number of the warships he had, Calenus was now asked by Publius Vatinius to give him ships to go up and help relieve Illyricum, which was being attacked by Marcus Octavius. And we don't know exactly Calenus's perspective on this, but perhaps he declined the offer. Either that, or he simply was slow to react because most of his troops were committed facing east into the Aegean rather than west into the Gulf of Corinth. At any rate, Vatinius got impatient and ultimately went on without Calenus's troops and was successful in Illyricum. That being said, overall, Calenus did a great job with the task that he was given during the Greek campaign of 48, even if he didn't have a moment quite as shining as what Vatinius had up in Illyricum. Back in Italy, in Caesar's absence, there hadn't been regular elections for the consulship. Typically, an election for consul occurs the year before the consuls take office, and then that way on January 1st, or very early in January, the consuls can take office. Well, in the case of the year 47, there was no election in late 48, and that election kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed, all the way until Caesar returned from Alexandria around late September or early October. Once Caesar got home, he decided to hold an election, and the two men who were elected were Quintus Fufius Calenus and Publius Vatinius. Both of them were elected for largely the same reason, namely that they had both been excellent servants of Caesar for a number of years. Both of them had started out in 59, and they had performed well and frequently ever since. Their consulship together was a little bit underwhelming, however, because they didn't have a lot of time in office, and any crises that might have occurred would have been handled by Caesar himself, since he would spend the rest of 47 in Italy organizing his armies and handling his various affairs. He was mostly prepping for an invasion of Africa against Metellus Scipio's army. And so the two consuls didn't have that much to do. Probably the highlight of their year together was going to Alba Longa to celebrate the Latin festival, which was a fairly big deal and noteworthy, but hardly the kind of climatic event that one would want to have during a consulship. And so for Calenus, this must have seemed like a disappointing peak, that his peak was a little bit boring, frankly, and that his reward at the end of the Civil War, or at least toward the end of the Civil War, was underwhelming. Nonetheless, he had succeeded by any measure. He had become a consul as a new man, and so he had really set his family up for future success. He had put his name on the consular fasti. He had done a lot of good work here. So he had a lot of reasons to be satisfied, even if this was not necessarily the most exciting or dramatic consulship that one could imagine. That being said, he would have a better exit than this, although it was far from clear that this would be the case in 47. Going into 44, Calenus was in a great position. He was an ex-consul, and he would certainly have a lot of pull in the Senate, especially since there weren't very many other consulars, there weren't very many other people with seniority on him, and most of the people there were fellow Caesarians, at least the people in the senior ranks, and so he could expect to be one of the grand old men of the Senate, which is a pretty satisfying conclusion to a career where you started off as someone who was most likely not going to make it to be consul. He also knew that his son-in-law was the pre-elected consul for 43, so Caesar made a couple years of elections ahead of time before he left for his Parthian War. And so most likely Calenus was looking forward to Caesar's departure and looking forward to being one of the first men in Rome. However, on the Ides of March in 44, March 15th that is, Caesar was dramatically assassinated in the theater of Pompey. And this threw everything into confusion. Now it was unclear where people like Calenus actually stood. It was unclear who his allies were. And so he now had to try to find his place once again. Who would he align himself with? Would there be a conflict due to Caesar's death? What was going to happen? Would the appointments that Caesar made stand? At first it looked like the world would keep its peace. Antony and the other Caesarians largely cooperated with the assassins, and for months they were mostly on decent terms. However, things would start to break down a bit by the year's end, especially even by the summer, but especially by the year's end, it was clear that a conflict was brewing. As for Calenus's relationships, we know of his relationships with his son-in-law Pansa, and also his relationship with Cicero. In the case of Cicero, Calenus actually writes to Cicero to request reconciliation, and Cicero writes back and says that he is okay with that. Of course, privately, Cicero will complain to his friend Atticus that he finds Calenus to be obnoxious, and that he's not really a big fan, but he says he needs to be cautious and make as many friends as possible. So Calenus and Cicero both are acting in a fairly self-serving way to try to cover their bases and protect themselves. And this is probably what most of the senators in Rome are doing, by the way. As for Calenus's relationship with Pansa, he most likely is a bit upset because as 44 drags on, Pansa is moving more into the position of someone who wants to keep the Caesarians together and avenge Caesar. So he wants to fight the assassins. So that's the attitude Pansa has when he first takes office in early 43. And Calenus does not seem to have been terribly amenable to that at the time. Now, the goals of the various leaders in the Senate by the end of 44 have become fairly clear. Calenus's goal is to keep the Caesarian leaders united more or less, and also at peace with the assassins. He does not want there to be a war. He also doesn't want there to be conflict between, say, Antony and Octavian. Whereas Cicero's goal was very much to reward and promote Octavian, who now had the name Gaius Julius Caesar, and pit him against Antony. so he wanted to divide and conquer the Caesarians. Pansa, by this point, despite being a Caesarian and despite being someone who had served Caesar loyally and well for a number of years, was in early 43 mostly with Cicero and the assassins. He was not quite as far in the tank for this position as Cicero was, but he certainly was in favor of making war on Mark Antony. And so Calenus was actually primed to be a major player in this debate, even if he didn't necessarily have the strongest position. That being said, he was still game for it and was determined to press forward with his views. For most of 44, to the extent that anyone was running the Senate, it was Mark Antony, and he had the Senate vote to remove Decimus Brutus from his governorship in Cisalpine Gaul. However, Decimus Brutus refused to leave, and so Antony took up arms to remove him, and this would begin the Mutina campaign. Now Antony was gone to fight in the field, and the Senate was now mostly in the hands of men like Calenus and Cicero. And so, with Antony gone, they started to debate what to do about Mark Antony and Decimus Brutus up in northern Italy. So on January 1st, 43, there was a heated debate right out of the gate as to whether they should send an embassy to Mark Antony or to outlaw him. So these are two very stark positions. The idea of sending an embassy to Antony to make peace was the idea of Calenus, whereas the decision or the opinion that he should be outlawed and they should declare war against him was Cicero's opinion. Now, Calenus actually got to speak first in this debate because Pansa, as the presiding consul, was able to pick speakers, and he picked his father-in-law to speak first. So Pansa made the initial pitch for the embassy and for peace. Now, it seems that for the most part, Antony was actually not receptive to Calenus's efforts, and he actually wrote back letters and mocked these kind of peace ideas. He said that they didn't have anything to discuss that would require multiple consuls to come out to meet with him. So while a number of people, mostly Cicero and his various readers who don't read other sources, have said that indeed Calenus was just in the tank for Antony the whole time, but the evidence actually taken as a whole, as Anna Miajuska has argued, I think persuasively, shows that in fact Calenus was doing something rather different. He was trying to prevent war from breaking out. He was trying to foil Cicero's strategy of divide and conquer and maintain peace. Now, the various Philippic speeches that Cicero would deliver were over a pretty short period of time. Almost all of these speeches, 14 in all, were delivered within just 2 months, or maybe 3 at most. During the fifth Philippic, Cicero would call for the passage of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which is an official decree saying that all measures are now allowed against the outlaw Antony. And he also wanted honors for Decimus Brutus and Marcus Lepidus. For Brutus, it was for fighting Antony, and for Lepidus, it was for basically just being in the field with a bunch of men and hopefully winning him over for their side, even though he was more of a Caesarian. And Cicero also wanted Octavian made a pro-praetor. Overall, Cicero kind of got what he wanted during that debate. He got the honors for Brutus and Lepidus and also powers for Octavian, but the Senate still believed that Calenus's approach of trying to reconcile Antony with his enemies was the correct approach overall. So while strengthening Antony's enemies, they still wanted to keep the door open for reconciliation. And so they sent out an embassy of 5 former consuls. So it was kind of a mixed bag. And we see that the Senate is very much divided on the issue. The issue was not an easy one. They did not want to see war ravage Italy. At the same time, though, clearly Antony was not super popular in the Senate. Many people in the Senate saw him as irresponsible, and they also saw themselves as better leaders than he was. It's worth mentioning that almost everything that we know about this exchange between Cicero and Calenus during early 43 comes to us from Cicero's own Philippics. And we do have a little bit of evidence also from Cassius Dio and from Appian, but most of the details are from Cicero's own speeches, so we know his side of the thing far better than we know Calenus's. That being said, he does quote Calenus sometimes, so we're not entirely unsure about what Calenus wanted. We just don't know a lot of the details. And of course, what we do know is mostly presented in a negative way. At any rate, the biggest blow that Calenus would face during these discussions, during this prolonged debate, is that the embassy that he attended ended up being a flaming failure. Antony had no interest in reconciliation, and then one of the 5 consulars who went out on the embassy died on the way back. And so the whole thing was an unmitigated failure, and this led Cicero once again to say that peace was for fools, that Calenus was in fact either a coward or an Antony puppet, and that true Romans would go to war with Mark Antony. And then other news arrived. In this case, this was news that kind of proved Calenus's point that it was not just Antony who was engaged in irregularity, but at the same time it was news that was mostly welcomed by most of the people in the Senate. And that news was that Brutus had gone to Greece, supposedly to study philosophy in Athens, but then instead he had started commandeering provinces and troops. He went to Publius Vatinius's legions in Illyricum and had them declare for himself, and he also went to Mark Antony's brother Gaius Antonius in Macedonia and kicked him out of office. So Brutus seized almost the entire Balkans. Now, Calenus said that this was an illegal act, and he said that this is something that was not warranted by anything, that this was unprovoked aggression. However, because he knew that the Senate was a little bit more favorable to the assassins than to Antony or Antony's brother, Calenus refrained from saying anything about punishing Brutus, really. He just demanded that Brutus resign. And he said that the reason why he should resign is because him going out and seizing territories like this was an insult to Caesar's veterans. After all, they should respect Caesar's appointments. They had all agreed to that in the aftermath of the Ides of March. Well, Cicero, knowing that he had the strength on his side in the Senate, delivered the 10th Philippic, and he not only said that Brutus had done something that was right, but that he should be confirmed in these offices. And in the process, he was gloating about what had happened, and he took a lot of shots both at Antony and at Calenus. So this was in many ways one of the prouder moments of Cicero's career, and it looked like he was about to prevail altogether. It looked like Antony's position was crumbling rapidly, and that all of his allies were just being kicked out of office, and that the assassins were going to get away scot-free for having killed Caesar. Despite the fact that things didn't look that great for Calenus, the worm was about to turn. In a world where one Brutus had refused to obey the Senate's orders, and another Brutus had of his own accord seized all of Macedonia, it should come as no surprise that there were other men with other names who were more than willing to resort to violence, and one of them was Publius Cornelius Dolabella. He had recently served as Suffolk consul, and he happened to be Cicero's son-in-law. He was a well-connected Caesarian and kind of a man about town. So when he randomly happened to be passing through Asia on his way to Syria, where he was set to be governor, he took it upon himself, to the shock of the entire world, to illegally arrest, torture, and then kill the governor there, Gaius Trebonius. Trebonius had once been a Caesarian, but had then become one of the assassins. So perhaps it was a personal feud. At any rate, though, the real problem here was not that he randomly seized the province, obviously that was in the air at the moment, but rather that he had used torture. Because we have to remember, one of the major perks of Roman citizenship is that you are immune to torture. And this is especially important for the elite. They did not want to be subject to torture. And so, while they had broken down many, many norms by this point, this was one that the Romans were not willing to see violated. So this was something that horrified everyone back in Rome, the fact that Dolabella had tortured a fellow Roman senator. And so this meant that the Senate was unanimously against Dolabella. Even Cicero in private was very displeased and disappointed. Now, he clearly, because of his personal interest, would have saved Dolabella if possible, but he knew that the political tide was too strong, so even Cicero made no attempt whatsoever to in any way defend his son-in-law. He actually added to the chorus of condemnation. But the lead here naturally went to Calenus. So Calenus regained his leadership in the Senate, he went on the floor, and he passed a motion that unanimously condemned Dolabella. But then there was to be another fight. So, because Dolabella was such a criminal, and also had a fairly weak command in Asia, there were many people wanting the honor of bringing him to justice. This was one of the few causes that someone could fight that would bring honor and glory, while also giving them an army in the field for the civil war that seemed very likely to break out in the near future. So it was a very high stakes issue as to who should go out and bring Dolabella to heel. And so in this debate, all the major players in Rome had their own ideas. Calenus wanted for one of the two consuls, either Pansa or Hirtius, to go out and take command. This was the kind of default position. And also, of course, this was a way for him to really honor his son-in-law and try to bring him closer, or to win over Hirtius, if that wasn't possible. Lucius Julius Caesar, the surviving elder cousin of the dictator, wanted to give a special command to Publius Servilius, and the other idea was proposed by Cicero, who wanted to double down on assassins and high commands by empowering the outgoing governor of Syria, the man Dolabella was supposed to replace, Gaius Cassius Longinus, to instead renew his imperium and then go and deal with Dolabella. So Cicero was completely undeterred and unashamed by his son-in-law's actions, in a way. He wanted to turn this to his advantage and turn the entire East into an area held by Brutus and Cassius. And of course, that's kind of what ends up happening in the long run, but not here at this time. Because what ends up happening is that the consul Pansa, who up to this time has actually not been super receptive to his father-in-law's ideas, actually chews out Cicero pretty severely and then pushes for his father-in-law's proposal. So this means that now Calenus and Pansa, despite their earlier political differences, are moving closer together, and this is sort of the low point for Cicero in this debate. So at this point, it looks like the Caesarians will regain that governorship. Now, of course, Dolabella had kind of regained it for them, but in a way that was unacceptable. So they were still retaining an advantage. They would also have a pincer on Brutus to contain him. So up to this point, it looked like they were holding their ground pretty well, and that Cicero's plans were falling through. Since we will no doubt have many opportunities to discuss these issues, I'm not going to go through them here. Suffice it to say, though, that the debate continued with Calenus not being a big factor, and the debate eventually boiled down to Cicero getting his way, war being declared on Antony, and Octavian being empowered by a Cicero-led Senate. So Octavian, serving as pro-praetor, worked with the two consuls Pansa and Hirtius. Presumably by this time Pansa had come back around to Cicero's way of thinking, or at least been outvoted and outmaneuvered, and the three of them together would prevail over Antony at Mutina, relieving the siege of Decimus Brutus. But while they smashed Antony's army, the two consuls both died. So this was a major blow for a lot of people, including Calenus, because Calenus by this point had largely aligned himself with Antony. And this is probably mostly because Cicero kept accusing him of being a puppet anyway, so Calenus had sort of been forced by being verbally abused to adopt that position a bit. But also his son-in-law, who gave him some cover, was gone, and all of the commands in the Roman world at this point were in the hands of people who were not all that terribly well disposed to Calenus. So Brutus, Cassius, and Sextus Pompeius were all now holding official commands, and Cicero, who was annoyed with Calenus, was master of the Senate. Calenus, however, hadn't done enough things that would get him condemned, so he would not be kicked out of the Senate or killed or anything like that in all likelihood, but his time of influence looked like it was just about to draw to a close. However, the world was shocked once again when Antony went before Lepidus's men. Those men preferred Antony to Lepidus by quite a bit, and the two of them became allies of necessity. They began to negotiate with the surviving commander from Mutina, Octavian, and together the three men decided to throw their lots together and become the Second Triumvirate. So once again, when things were at their darkest for Calenus, the dawn came. And in this case, he had played his cards exactly right. Antony, despite mocking some of his peace efforts earlier, was now quite grateful, and Calenus and Antony would now become pretty good friends going forward. In fact, of all of Antony's various supporters, it seems like he might have actually trusted Calenus more than anyone else. Once Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, they resolved to go to war against Brutus and Cassius in the east. And so finally, there would be a battle to determine who had been right on the Ides of March. And in the event, of course, Antony and Octavian would prevail. When they left for the east, they left Lepidus behind in Rome, so Lepidus was running affairs in the west. Meanwhile, Calenus was defending Italy itself, so he had 2 legions. That is to say that Lepidus, despite being one of the 3 men in charge of the Roman world, had 0 troops. Well, that was going to be a problem for him, because as soon as Octavian came home from the west, he informed Lepidus that, in fact, he had no troops, and therefore he was being demoted and relegated to Africa. So Lepidus was still going to be a triumvirate in name only, but for now he was basically just governor of Africa, and more or less almost under house arrest under Octavian's supervision. But that's a different sad story for a different day. We will, of course, be talking about Lepidus at some point. Anyway, one of the men who would benefit from Lepidus's downfall and from the victory at Philippi would be Quintus Fufius Calenus. So after the war was concluded in 41, there was an opening. Lepidus's old command that he had held prior to the formation of the Second Triumvirate, the control of Nearer Spain and Transalpine Gaul, and this came with a large army because these areas were still restive, and so that command would fall to 2 men. Most likely this is because Octavian and Antony wanted to make sure that no one would be a new Lepidus, that there would be no one with the ability to command a large army by himself and threaten their power. And so they split this command between Calenus and his old, often colleague, Publius Vatinius. So both men were to go to Gaul and command this army. Now, again, the traditional view of all this is that Calenus was an Antony man, but clearly he must have been on at least good terms or okay terms with Octavian. We also have to keep in mind that Vatinius must have been in the same boat, that he could not have possibly been on bad terms with either man. But what I'll show you in a minute is that, based on the way that things played out, it looks like actually Calenus might have been Octavian's choice, whereas the choice of Antony may very well have been Vatinius. So let's see why that is probably the case. In late 41, a new war broke out to break the peace. This would see Calenus and Vatinius still in command up in Gaul, but this time the disturbance came not from Octavian or Mark Antony, but rather from Antony's younger brother Lucius, along with Antony's wife Fulvia. The 2 of them decided to start a revolt against Octavian and to try to knock him out in the same way that Octavian had knocked out Lepidus. And the strategic calculus by Lucius Antonius may have been that he could win immediately and early, and then be reinforced by other pro-Antonian forces, but it's also possible that he was banking upon the intervention of the armies in Gaul, which would be the nearest major resource for the war in Italy. After all, in winter it's dangerous to move men by sea, but it's still plausible to move men by land. And so Vatinius and Calenus would be the best and most viable source of reinforcements. Vatinius was all in. He wanted to go help Lucius Antonius immediately. However, Calenus stayed his hand. He said that they should remain aloof, that this was none of their business and that they should not intervene. And I have to think that perhaps this is what shows that Calenus was the choice of Octavian, that perhaps Mark Antony understood Vatinius was more his guy, and so Octavian actually wanted Calenus to be his representative. And so the 2 men canceled each other out, nothing happened. Vatinius seems to have died first. Both of these men would die of natural causes this winter. Vatinius seems to have died first, and at this point, either when Vatinius was still alive or later, had Calenus been amenable to an invasion, it is almost certain that this would have been enough to tip the scales against Octavian and his general Agrippa, and to fundamentally alter Roman history. Although then we have to wonder what would happen between Mark Antony and his brother Lucius, but that is an alternative history scenario that is a little far-fetched, but at any rate, that would never come to pass in real history because Quintus Fufius Calenus would not end up marching in. He might have considered it, he might have even been making preparations at one point to intervene, but he ultimately fell ill and died before anything could happen. In the meantime, the Perusine War resolved itself, and Octavian proved to be the victor. Another big reason why Lucius Antonius lost is because his brother said, "I never authorized that, and I have no interest whatsoever in fighting Octavian. What are you doing?" And so because of that, Lucius Antonius didn't have a leg to stand on, Octavian won, and immediately after his victory, one of his first moves was to go up to Gaul and receive the adulation and allegiance of the men who had been under Calenus and Vatinius. So those men are now firmly in Octavian's camp. And it's winning over all of those troops with the help of the younger Quintus Fufius Calenus, no less, the son of the man we've been talking about, that these legions would come to be in Octavian's control, and that Octavian would now be fully equal to Antony for the first time. Up to this point, Antony has been clearly stronger and certainly more prestigious, but at this point, Octavian has now evened the odds a bit. He's neutralized Lepidus, and he also has taken over many of the legions in the west. So Octavian is now in a position to compete with Antony, and we all know how that goes eventually. Quintus Fufius Calenus is one of the more important Romans that you've never heard of. He was a capable man, and he contributed a great deal to Caesar's cause. One of the kind of stereotypes that get circulated about the men who followed Caesar is that most of them were young and undistinguished, but Calenus was actually older. He was about the same age as Caesar, and clearly he was not lacking for ability or experience, and he served Caesar well in a number of capacities. He also had real political talent in his own right. He was a fairly smooth operator. He doesn't seem to have been hyper-charismatic, but he still was pretty effective. He also knew how to play with fire without getting burned. He was able to go against the majority in the Senate without getting condemned or outlawed. He also was able to be a part of Caesar's consulship without getting taken to court over it. He knew how to play the game, and he played it quite well. Calenus also was an effective enough politician to go toe-to-toe with Cicero at the height of Cicero's powers. So arguably Cicero's greatest run in politics was his very last one, where he had just taken a long break to study philosophy. He had now come back, and he was passionately trying to, in his own way, save the Republic by eliminating all the Caesarians. And so Cicero delivered some of his best speeches at this time, and despite being on the receiving end of Cicero's wit, Calenus was able to withstand the barrage of words and to articulate a political alternative. He very much delayed the outbreak of war and came relatively close to creating an alternative resolution. Ultimately, he was kind of driven into Antony's camp, in my opinion, by Cicero's attacks against him and by Cicero effectively painting him into a corner. I don't think he really wanted to go with Antony, but when he did, Antony was receptive. And the reason why Antony was so receptive of him is precisely because Calenus was a capable guy. Calenus was a great person to have in your corner. He had a lot of talent. He also had a lot of seniority by that point compared to other people. And so he was one of the biggest and most influential backers of the Second Triumvirate. And his death in early 40 BCE, as I mentioned, was also incredibly important in the resolution of the Perusine War and in the eventual triumph of Octavian. In theory, had he been an Antony man, as traditional scholarship has claimed, then he and Vatinius might have intervened, and that might have been fatal for Octavian. But as it is, both old men passed away, and Octavian got their legions. So, while Calenus is not a household name, that does not mean by any means that he was a lightweight, or that he didn't play a huge role in politics for nearly 20 years. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.